Hello and welcome to the New Voice of Ukraine, a series of questions and answer interviews and explainers, where we have either one of our own journalists or is the case this week, an invited guest to talk about an issue that is important to Ukraine this week. This is a part of our premium content, so please go to patreon.com/NVUA, where you'll have a chance to give input on what these questions will be, interview topics. We want you to have input on what you want to learn about Ukraine. So this week we are joined by Oleh Kotsyuba. He is the Director of Print and Digital Publications at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. So Oleh, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what brought you to the show this week is, well, this series has largely become a series of the various ways in which the U.S. government has defunded various things supporting Ukraine. And this time around, we're talking about books, culture, and education in the broader sense of the term. So the short explanation here is that as part of the funding cuts made by the U.S. government, URI, Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute, lost funding for some of its programs. So we'll be asking you about what specifically happened. So, Oleh, so what exactly was cut? Was it, all of URI's programs, or was it just like a specific thing?
So it's actually a specific thing that was cut, and this is only the second time in over 30 years that we were able to receive this funding in the first place. Okay. Back in the 1980s, our institute, under the leadership at that time of Omelen Pritsak, a famous Turkologist who had founded the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard, together with Igor Shevchenko, he had applied for a grant from the same institution, the National Endowment for the Humanities, to translate and publish old works from medieval times, from the times of Kievan Rus, in a series that was called the Harvard Library of Early Ukrainian Literature. Then in 2021, we had launched a new series called simply the Harvard Library of Ukrainian Literature that focuses on the early modern to present day Ukrainian literature in English translation. And so in 2022, we had applied for a grant to publish 5 titles within that series. We had received 2/3 of the amount that we had asked for, and so we ended up reducing the number of books to be published down to 4. And those books included an anthology of Ukrainian Jewish poetry, the first of its kind. In either language, it was supposed to be a bilingual edition with scholarly commentary and many translations. It was also of Mike Johansson's prominent modernist novel called The Learned Dr. Leonardo's Journey, which is one of the key masterpieces of Ukrainian literary modernism. And it was supposed to fund the translation or publication of 2 plays by Lesia Ukrainka, one of key Ukrainian feminist authors and poets of the also modernist times. One of them is called The Blue Rose, which is her first play. So the last title by Lesia Ukrainka is called Forest Song, which is perhaps her most famous play. And we would have published a new translation of that play by 2 prominent translators. So these are the 4 books that were supposed to be published with the support from the National Endowment for Humanities, and now we have to figure out what to do about that.
Yeah, so a lot of these budget cuts have been rather haphazard. I heard a lot about the grants who they just did a Control F for the word diversity or something, and those were eliminated. So do you know much about the status for the National Endowment for Humanities in general? Are they still funding related things, or is it gone? I actually don't know much about the status of the National Endowment myself right now.
Mm-hmm. I'm not aware what is going on. Kind of what we see from news reports is that the administration is planning to basically let go about 70% of the staff of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and potentially even eliminated altogether. In terms of the process itself, we simply received a letter, and it happened to be on my birthday that our grant was terminated. That because apparently it did not advance the priorities of the president. And so just recently we were able to appeal that decision. We don't know how or if it will move forward. But we try to emphasize that Ukraine is clearly one of this president's priorities. The fact that he, on a regular basis comments on it, he meets with Ukrainian officials, including, at the highest level with President Zelensky himself, most recently in the Vatican at the funeral ceremony for Pope Francis. The fact that some of the highest ranking administration officials meet on a regular basis with Ukrainian officials, such as the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, for example, or Secretary Bessent, and so on. So all of this testifies to the fact that indeed this is one of the highest priorities for this administration. And so knowing more about the country, its history and culture obviously lies in the interest of the administration. The same applies also for the project on Ukrainian Jewish poetry, since the pretext for many other cuts at other universities has been fighting this alleged anti-Semitism on those campuses. And obviously that collection on Ukrainian Jewish poetry, it would contribute towards reducing any kind of sentiments of anti-Semitism, real or imagined, since we don't know exactly whether or not there is such widespread anti-Semitism on U.S. campuses. So either way, there hasn't been much of an explanation to us that would make logical sense why the grants were terminated. It's basically, it was just like a very boilerplate letter that we received.
Yeah, the editor in me is preventing me from commenting on everything because that anti-Semitism was related to the last question I wanted to ask, actually. So I'll hold off as much as I
That's
can
okay.
on that. So with this funding, though, so it's only this translation issue at Curie. Are there other programs at the Research Institute that are still going strong? And what are the real strengths of Curie?
So other programs were not affected by this simply because we basically never received any support from the federal government for other programs. And so for that reason, they're not affected. They continue at the same level as they, were implemented before. Of course, the factor of uncertainty now is that with this attack on the university, all budgets may get affected, including ours. So the administration is currently threatening to remove Harvard's nonprofit status and tax the endowment, right? So even though the university does nonprofit work, which is self-evident, and so it's unclear if that were to happen, then obviously all the funds are going to be then in danger. And we are funded through independent, restricted, endowed funds that were created when the institute was created back in the 1960s and 70s. But if those funds were to be taxed, then obviously that amount would have to be taken out of our budget. And as a result, that would obviously lead to the reduction of other projects. In terms of the strengths of the Institute, the flagship program is our publications program. So we have 6 different series that we publish of books, including this new series of translated literature, in which we have already published 15 volumes. We have Harvard Ukrainian Studies that we also publish already since 1977, and so on. Other programs include research fellowships for international scholars to come to Harvard and use our collection of materials on Ukrainian studies. And it's one of the largest, or perhaps the largest outside of Ukraine.
Because of the last thing you mentioned of organizing these scholars, especially to come to America, one thing that I've heard from a lot of academic institutes right now is that there are struggles with getting people to come to America because of some of the censorship issues, some of the increased difficulties of getting visas and such in general. So has Harvard in general, or Curie specifically, been facing issues with organizing like the physical presence of scholars to come to the U.S.?
We haven't experienced that firsthand yet, simply because the cycle is just now winding down. So the kind of the present, the fellows that are currently doing the research, they were already in the country at the time when the new administration took over. But the new cycle basically is beginning now, so we'll see, what issues we'll face later on in the summer when potentially fellowships are being announced and people have to make decisions whether or not to accept, and then how to proceed with applying for visas, etc. The general sense, however, is people are a little bit apprehensive to come. That's what I hear just from colleagues that I know in the field, because fearing harassment, literally, coming into the country, and also feeling under pressure when working here to abide by certain new expectations that were not the case before.
Yeah, I have heard from some of my colleagues who work in the more academic spaces or do a lot of international travel, that group. And yeah, I've heard a lot of people who feel kind of nervous about going to America right now. I can't fully blame them. We have heard stories of people being turned away at the airport because, yes, I don't know who specifically would have handled this, but someone like would check their phone for being critical of the administration, and they said, "Well, no, you're a hazard to national security," or something like that. And well, we can say that a lot of Ukrainian scholars have said less than kind things about President Trump for various reasons. True. So there would definitely be part of it.
Yes, if I can just add to this, freedom of thought and of expression is at the core of academic freedoms. If we are not able to think freely and to say what we believe to be true, then we cannot be objective scholars. And objectivity is basically what we strive for. Obviously, we're all human, and we all, may be affected by our own bias, being brought up in a certain environment, having had certain experiences and so on. But as scholars, we strive for objectivity, and the whole kind of academic process is designed to remove as much of subjectivity as possible. But if we are not able to freely express what we believe, based on facts that we observe and study, then obviously that undermines the entire enterprise of being scholars. And scholarship, academia in general, is the foundation of our advanced society. Without all of kind of this apparatus, obviously we are going to regress. So I feel that's the danger. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. The issue of freedom of expression, and especially because the Ivy Leagues are being quite directly targeted right now. And it's not just the Ivies. I went to Michigan State. There are some issues of Michigan State having some problems with this exact issue as well. But the Ivies are obviously have the prestige, have the fame, and therefore are kind of the front line of this issue. So on the question of the defunding in general, of how that could affect Curie, the last interview we did was about Ukrainian refugees in America, and about how they weren't being specifically targeted necessarily by the cuts to the refugee programs, but because everything was being cut, they were also cut along with it. So with the general issue of universities potentially losing some of their funding, the tax issue, is there any planning going on right now at Yuri to perhaps scale back at all, or um I guess fight the issue as well, because this is being challenged in courts constantly and people are winning sometimes. So what is there a strategy to kind of deal with potentially having work cut come the fall?
So we are a part of Harvard University, a department of the university, and so we are largely following the lead of the university leadership on this. Like I mentioned, we have appealed the termination of the grants. So that's one step. That's something that we did. On the other hand, when we were projecting the next year's fiscal budget, so our fiscal year starts in July, we already implemented contingency plans to make sure that in case we need to reduce our activities, that we have a plan to do that without undermining the core mission of the institute. And obviously, these are very difficult decisions because projects that have been in the works for many years are at stake. As you can imagine, to write a scholarly book, or to write a translation of a highly complex work, it takes years. And so people who will be affected by that have poured their lives into this project, dedicated many years of their lives. And so, therefore, these are very difficult decisions. We don't take them lightly. We look at everything 2 and 3 times. We are also reaching out to all potential supporters that we have to see if they can support us at this difficult time. We have applied for funding with various foundations and humanitarian aid organizations that have provided aid to Ukraine in the past 4 years and more, such as Razom for Ukraine, for example, or Nova Ukraine, the Hukus Foundation,
We did
or
the first two you talked about,
Mhm.
actually.
That's right. That's right. United Help Ukraine is another wonderful organization. So some of them have come forward with limited funds to support our publications, our other projects. With others, we're still in the process of determining whether or not they would be able to support us. Other than that, we have not been able to secure considerable funding to compensate in case that more cuts are coming. It's obviously also a very difficult situation, ethically speaking, because we would be competing with donations going towards Ukraine, towards saving lives in Ukraine, and so obviously that is the first priority for many donors, and we don't want to interfere with that. On the other hand, we do believe that it's strategically very important to have Ukrainian voice established at this kind of level. For Harvard University to publish works of Ukrainian authors, so writers, but also scholars, to have scholarly studies on Ukraine and from Ukraine published in English at Harvard University. All of that establishes Ukraine at a certain level with along with other disciplines in the current global academia. And so without that, obviously Ukraine would be more at risk for repeated aggression, we feel. And so investing into the future and investing into maintaining this level of presence, we perceive as something that is strategic.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent segue into this next chunk of questions I have here, which is kind of the status of Ukraine studies within the academic system in general. And one thing that is often pointed out throughout this war is that it is very much also a fight for Ukrainian culture, for Ukrainian identity, for putting national idea like in front of the world, and not just as the other small Russia that has often unfortunately been the stereotype that Ukraine has had to kind of slug along with it for. I mean, throughout my whole life growing up, it was always those countries over there that are just emanations of Russia rather than their own proud peoples on their own terms. So what can you say? Give your pitch for, of course, the issue of funding, like you just said. It always comes up in Ukraine of, can I give money even to like this animal shelter or something rather than buying a drone for the army. It all kind of flows back into that. What is defending us? What is protecting us? But I do see this as an important aspect of the war. So can you give your pitch for perhaps funding for cultural projects, not just through Shuri Harvard, but in general?
Yes, absolutely. I think the first thing that we need to realize is that this is not a war for territory. Russia is the largest country in the world already. It certainly has enough territory that it doesn't even know how to manage properly. So the reason that Russia is attacking Ukraine is not because Russia wants, a square mileage, of certain land. This is truly about Ukrainian identity, who we are as Ukrainians, and what we believe, what we want to be. And because it's in such stark contrast to what the present regime in Russia, headed by Vladimir Putin, is trying to establish in Russia, that poses risks to Vladimir Putin's regime. And so as a result, this war is trying to destroy everything that is uniquely Ukrainian. We see how Russia is attacking schools, universities, hospitals, terrorizing people, trying to intimidate Ukrainians. And so from that perspective, it truly is important to defend everything that speaks about Ukrainian culture, that projects Ukrainian culture, creates it, and spreads it internationally. My approach to this is to perceive culture similarly to the NATO alliance, in which every member state commits to investing about 5% or less, depending on the country, but let's say 5% of the GDP into their own defense. And so I think that long term, we need to think strategically along similar lines. Different organizations, the Ukrainian state as such, organizations providing humanitarian aid to Ukraine, if they were all able to set aside just 5% of whatever donations they receive and dedicate it to Ukrainian culture, promotion, preservation of Ukrainian artifacts, publications, and so on, I think that a lot could be accomplished in defending Ukraine long term. We see that Vladimir Putin, before the full-scale invasion, has made statements about Ukraine that represent Ukraine as not a real country, not a real people, similarly, the same as Russians and so on. So kind of the whole attempt of this war has been to erase Ukrainians as something that is distinct culturally, linguistically, and otherwise. And so we also see how much Russia is relying on culture, something that they term the great Russian culture, in projecting its own strength around the world. Russia, should not be taking seriously, according to Russian government, as this great Russian culture. And so it has become an instrument in this war too. And so for Ukraine not to use Ukrainian culture to defend itself, not to protect Ukrainian culture, obviously would only aid this war effort that Russia has started. So from this perspective, I think it's absolutely crucial to invest. Of course, we need to consider immediate needs, and obviously saving human lives, investing in military defenses is priority number one. But investing steadily a small percentage of available funds in Ukrainian culture, in Ukrainian education, scholarship, and so on, I think is absolutely crucial for the long term.
Yeah, absolutely. This idea of soft power, of your culture is an element of your security. If you look at the United States, like there's a lot of people around the world who do not like American policy in a lot of ways, but we have Hollywood, we have, Levi's jeans was quite famous, had a role in the downfall of the Soviet Union. Pepsi, uh, Pepsi bought a fleet from the Soviet Union at one point to sell them Pepsi. Culture is a big deal. If North Korea invaded South Korea tomorrow, a large part of what will hold South Korea's defenses together is the influence of like K-pop. Like, it feels
That's
weird to
correct.
say, but because people around the world have that positive association with South Korea. If they hear something bad happens to South Korea, then they're more likely to care about it. And I feel that kind of the lack of Ukrainian cultural impact, and there's a lot of ways to problematize that. One way I see it is that
Hmm.
there's a lot of Ukrainian things that are not recognized as Ukrainian, which has always been a
Hmm. Hmm.
serious issue with doing that. But like books, academia are a big part of that. With Harvard, it's very important to have a Ukrainian thing at Harvard, but it seems as though there are not many Ukraine specific institutes around higher education. They are usually nested within like Russian studies, Slavic studies, Central East European studies, and there's not many research institutes that deal with Ukraine specifically. So, can you explain the logic of why Harvard created this? There are others, of course. Timothy Snyder, who was until recently at Yale, Toronto. There's a few in Canada. Canada is especially is a bit of a hotbed for this. But for Harvard, what was the logic in creating this, and what has been the experience of being a Ukrainian research institute when there's not very many of them in general?
Hmm. Hmm. Yes, obviously, the Harvard is what is often referred to as the Ukrainian Harvard miracle. The fact that we don't have a German institute here, for example, or a Polish institute, not to speak of Hungarian, Romanian, and so on. So countries farther to the west of Ukraine and considerably, more integrated with the West, they don't have such presence, on perhaps the most, famous and well recognized university in the world. And so this has been a strategic vision that the Ukrainian community here in the United States advanced, and for which it, launched a whole grassroots campaign collecting small dollar donations over decades in order to make this happen. The fact that the university agreed to this in the first place was truly, a miraculous event because obviously Ukraine did not exist on the political map back in 1973 when the institute was founded, or in 1968 when the committee to create the institute was founded at Harvard. So this largely is thanks to the vision and the hard work of Ukrainian American community, which included Omelian Pritsak, whom I already mentioned, famous Turkologist, which included Igor Shevchenko, who was a prominent Byzantologist, both of them professors at Harvard at the time, and who were able to convince their colleagues, such as Ed Keenan, many others, Richard Pipes, the economist, and others at Harvard to support this initiative. And so they joined them and lobbied the administration to make this happen. And of course, the work of the Ukrainian community was very important. Ukrainian students worked very hard to literally weekly, doing events at various communities, Ukrainian communities across the United States, and collected donations. The work of the Ukrainian Studies Fund that was specifically launched to support the creation of the 3 chairs in Ukrainian studies at Harvard and the institute itself. So all of that, is a culmination of, truly hard work of a great number of people on a grassroots level. And that's what's so wonderful about our institute, namely that it was not a top-down initiative. It was a down-up, bottom-up initiative in the first place. We are the only such institution in the United States. In Canada, after us, the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was created at the University of Alberta, which has also representation in Toronto. Other than that, there weren't many professors of Ukrainian studies at American universities. Only recently, we have seen some development, actually, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion. Now that we have, assistant professor of Ukrainian culture at University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, there is a Ukrainian studies program at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. There is a Ukrainian program at Kansas University, Penn State, Columbia, Now since also not too long ago, Stanford and University of California in San Diego. But that's pretty much it. And the kind of the representation at those universities is usually rather minimal. So it's one, at most two scholars, which of course is a huge achievement. It has been really difficult to accomplish, which we need to recognize. But the problem with such nesting, as you put it, in larger departments is that these people usually then the scholars, they don't have a community of other scholars to communicate with. Very often ideas for research emerge through collaboration, through interaction with other scholars who are interested in similar things, at least broadly speaking. And being the only Ukraine scholar in a Slavic department, which usually means a Russian department, by the way, basically means you're entirely alone. No one knows, what you have to study or how to do these things. Even if you're delivering lectures and presentations, people can't engage that much because they don't know as much about the subject matter and so on. So that creates a whole different level of discourse. You basically are enlightening people who, for the first time, hear about this Ukrainian writer or that Ukrainian poet, or and so on. So we can continue this. So the role of our institute, therefore, in that kind of situation, is to try and bring these people together. And there are other organizations in the United States and in the world that try to do that as well. For example, the Shevchenko Scientific Society in the US that has been very active at providing a platform, a forum for scholars of Ukraine that are spread across various universities, often not even holding a Ukraine-related position, but still willing to engage in Ukrainian studies, basically, in their free time when they are not teaching and doing research for their main employment. But our institute does that obviously in a much more professional manner, precisely because we have those small endowed funds that we use to support the scholars, and because we have the scholars, the professors of Ukrainian history, literature, and linguistics here at Harvard that are able to advise and support such scholars when they come here.
Yeah, that's definitely one thing that I noticed from a lot of even people who have come to Ukraine on, say, Fulbright, for example. And I remember I've been here for a while, so thinking back to 2015 or so, and a lot of the scholars who had come to Ukraine were, well, a lot of them were Ukraine scholars. Not going to completely go over that, but a lot of them were intended to go to Russia, but because the Russian government basically had closed down everything in the late 2010s because of the foreign agent laws and stuff like that. They shut down Fulbright, they shut down a lot of the exchange, and because of that, these scholars, instead of studying Russian in Moscow, they studied Russian in Odessa or something. And that's great. It's great to have people studying here, of course, but that's always through the filter of Russian studies still. I'm not going to criticize anything. They're all great. Like, they're all great people. So if you're listening, if I knew you in 2015, you're still great. But I do worry about that. So as the Ukrainian Research Institute, obviously, a lot of the people who will come through your doors will not specifically be Ukraine scholars. It's always, these institutes often have to be interdisciplinary by nature. And looking through your website, you cover everything, medievalists, everything will have to come through. So what is the strategy of kind of in Zen, there's the concept of beginner's mind, I guess, to get people to give up their preconceived notions. How do you induce that in people coming from, especially Russian studies, into Ukraine studies?
It's a very difficult question, and it's really hard to answer in a kind of succinct way, because this is a whole conversation that is happening on so many different levels. And obviously, we have already several generations of scholars that have run the institute and have employed different strategies of doing this. Omalan Pritsak, what was amazing about him, he was able to inspire people by empowering them. And so a lot of people who, back in the 70s and the 80s joined Ukrainian Studies, joined the field because of him, because he empowered them. He supported their ideas. And sometimes people would come with very um, you know, how should I put it? Strange, let's say strange notions of what they want to study, and it may only have had a tangential, relation to Ukraine, somewhere like far, far, far on the margin. But that did not dissuade Milan Pritsak from supporting these peoples. He would empower them, he would provide them resources, he would engage with them personally. And so this is something that I also believe in. And from my perspective, giving people who are already somewhat interested and want to do something deserve to receive all kind of support that we can provide today. Of course, our resources are not limitless. Of course, our time is not endless either. But I think finding ways to support people who express some interest in Ukraine today is absolutely key to change the situation in the field. The field of Slavic studies, especially in the United States, is largely Russian studies. It has been so basically since the 1980s. It was a little bit different before. It was more diversified. But for some reason, since the 80s and especially in the 90s, it coalesced more and more precisely around Russian studies. And so that's the bulk of what is studied. It just so happened that we used to have more scholars of Polish culture, history, and so on, of Czech, Yugoslavian, and so on our campuses back in the 60s and 70s than we ended up having in the 80s, 90s, and then 2000s. And so the reality then is that these people reproduce the same kind of scholars that they are, for the most part. Not always, but mostly. And obviously, the question of exposure for me is the key here. If scholars, being bachelor student, masters, or PhDs, when they reach that stage, are never exposed to anything but Russian culture, and that's presented to them as the Slavic studies, then obviously they already entering the field with very kind of narrow idea of what is a major culture, so to speak, what is a minor culture, and so on. Ukrainians, Czechs, Poles are often relegated to being this ultra nationalists simply for wanting to study and teach their cultures, their languages and literatures. And so, but that's not the case that's not how the Russian culture is viewed. For some reason, Russian culture is viewed as this more universal, kind of more all-embracing worldly culture and so on, which it isn't. It's just perceived that way. Every culture is deeply national. And so it's all about positioning and it's about exposure. And so I feel that what is really important is to get these scholars and students more broadly exposed to as much of other cultures and literatures and histories as we possibly can. And Ukrainian literature and culture obviously is one of them, but not the only one. But already that kind of just being exposed to this other context, I think, creates a lot of openness going forward. And people who have been exposed to other contexts, they are kind of, I feel already, kind of our natural allies. Whereas trying to convince someone who is, deep, who is a believer in the Russian imperial culture, or kind of supports this whole idea that Russia has the right to quote unquote collect its lands and so on. Obviously, it's already a lost cause. I don't see how we can effectively engage with them, even in a fact-based discussion, because they're on a completely different ground than we are. So there's very little common ground there to begin with. And so, that's the kind of fracturing in the field that we're observing today.
And on that, the issue, academia often goes in trends, what's happening in the world, from an international relations program in the late 2000s. And therefore, I learned, as a Middle East specialist, especially political Islam. I know my Hassan al-Banna, all that stuff. But that was kind of a result of the times. It was an unfortunate time, but that's what you learned. And so now with Russia rampaging around, of the Russian invasion of Ukraine being a major headline in the world, a major policy issue, has Ukraine Studies caught up with that? Are there more programs? Are there more language programs? Like at the time, we had just introduced a full-fledged Arabic language program a couple years into the Iraq War. Probably should have had that beforehand, but it comes eventually. So, has there been more interest in Ukraine studies from especially undergraduate students?
We definitely see that, and it usually depends on, of course, the people who are teaching at these universities. And so we're lucky to have, a whole generation of young scholars now that are entering the field, such as Alexander Averbuch, Yulia Khometa, Oleh Titarenko, for example, as well as established scholars such as Vitaly Chernetsky, of course, George Grabovich, now who has now retired, but Serhiy Plokhy obviously continues to be active and very productive. Tim Snyder, even in Toronto, obviously is continuing to work on Ukrainian studies and so on. So there is definitely interest, and the reason for that, I think, is because Ukraine offers a unique perspective on Russia. Through the Ukrainian perspective, through the Ukrainian experience, you gain unique knowledge about the nature of Russia, and that I feel is very important. So both for the policymakers, United States and elsewhere in the West, but also for regular individuals who are trying to understand the situation and what is happening. We're witnessing the largest war in Europe since World War II. Things that are afoot right now obviously are going to continue. They're not going to stop existing, even if the war ended tomorrow, for whatever, with whatever outcome. And so obviously there is a lot of intellectual curiosity about that, and kind of the need to understand and adjust properly. There has been, a tremendous deficit of knowledge and expertise on Ukraine, and as a result on Russia, because of the lack of funding, the lack of investment in Ukrainian studies and in Slavic studies more broadly. And of course, if you only emphasize kind of this Russia-centered view of Russia itself and Eastern Europe and so on, then you're also missing out on a lot of important facts and information, right? So then kind of your policy,
positive way, you're still viewing Ukraine that Russian lens.
absolutely, exactly. I mean, that's the problem with the Russian opposition, right? That they, unfortunately today they're being presented, including in the Western media, as this kind of heroes that are somehow the alternative to Vladimir Putin. But even Navalny, like Alexei Navalny himself, was a staunch nationalist who, did not acknowledge Ukraine's sovereignty over Crimea, for example, who did not endorse, withdrawal from the war and so on. So it's all very problematic. Anyway, so there's definitely a lot more interest now. We see that the enrollments are increasing. There are programs at a number of universities. The only question for us is how permanent those changes are. And that has to do, again, unfortunately, with funding, with investment. To make those changes permanent, these positions have to be made institutional, right? They have to be a permanent part of the university. And we don't know if that is the case yet. With some universities, they have established this position, but we don't know what's going to happen in a decade or two. Other universities are working to create such positions, such as, for example, the Berkeley, that has received $3 million from the Open Societies and is raising $6 million more to establish a Ukrainian studies program. So, which obviously is meant to include more than just one position of a professorship, but perhaps also other activities. So I feel that's one kind of big area. But the other big area is that academia as such is in crisis today. And so we need to consider the possibility that academia in its current state, in its current shape, may not survive this administration. So then the question becomes, how can we continue educating people working from outside of academic institutions? We are competing today, kind of more globally speaking, more broadly speaking, in content delivery with social media, with short clips, of video clips on TikTok and so on. This is what the current generation is accustomed to consuming. We don't see that many people anymore reading thick books, on subways or wherever they are, or even on their electronic devices, right? So there's a major shift happening in how people consume information, how they educate themselves, how they spend their time in general. And so we need to be very perceptive of that. And so if we are to project knowledge of Ukrainian voices in the world, we need to adapt as well and find ways to continue doing it effectively, even if one of the key mechanisms of delivering and creating that knowledge may, in some form, uh, perhaps not be what it is today.
Well, on short form content, we do have book talk, and the problems that I don't know. I'm not going to get into a book talk Discord, but that is one of the main ways that literature is distributed right now. Is that there will be someone making a 2 minute long video about why this book is good and you should read it, and it's not just literature as it's often considered. I see a lot of history book talk people. It's a major thing. If you go to a bookstore, they'll have the book talk section. So it isn't just literature, and even when you are dealing with just literature, that does have to expand into multimedia, everything else as well.
That's
But
right.
for our last section here, I want to get into, I guess, a pitch for some of these books is that of this group of translations that you have done, and I will say that a lot of these translations have been rather sparse in English, especially with Lesia Ukrainka. It feels impossible to find anything she wrote in English. So what are some of the works that the Ukrainian Research Institute has translated specifically, but we can talk about other things, but specifically the works that you've translated that people might want to read? Where's some of the good ones?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that question. We have worked very hard in the last 3.5 years to launch this series, and the fact that we have already 15 volumes in just 3.5 years, and especially if you think about how long it takes to translate a work and to comment on it and kind of have it in a very high level translation, it's a tremendous amount of work. So I invite everyone to head to our website. It's books.curie.harvard.edu and check out our full list. I will just highlight a few. For example, the works by Stanislav Aseyev. He is a Ukrainian journalist and writer from Donetsk. We published 2 books of his. One is called In Isolation, and the other one is called The Torture Camp on Paradise Street. And so they basically describe what happens if, a territory, a city is taken over by Russia. How the kind of all of these ideas and institutions begin deteriorating. You no longer can say what you believe, right? Kind of the loss of the freedom of speech and thought. Suddenly, there is no rule of law anymore. You cannot rely on any courts or even on law enforcement to protect you, and you become a victim of violence sometimes without any cause. The other writer that we have published, for example, is Olena Styashkina, also from Donetsk. We published also 2 books of hers. One is a nonfiction, a diary called Ukraine, War, Love. And she describes basically the first 4 months of Russia's takeover of Donetsk. And the other book is a novel, very kind of highly experimental, very beautifully written. It's called Cecil the Lion Had to Die. And that novel spans basically several generations of Ukrainians living in the east of Ukraine and kind of emerging and rediscovering the Ukrainian identity and kind of understanding what it is actually that makes them Ukrainian and that makes them fight for what they believe in. And of course, we also have whole number of kind of Ukrainian classics, so to speak. We are about to publish Mike Johansson's beautiful experimental novel called um, the full title is rather long. So the title is The Learned Dr. Leonardo's Journey to Sloboda, Switzerland of Ukraine, with his future lover, the beautiful Alcesti. As you can imagine, already the title tells you how playful, exactly how playful and how wonderful this. It's actually called a landscape novel. So we just published, for example, Valerian Pinmohilny's novel "The City," which was the first Ukrainian urbanist novel. So in that urbanist novel, the cityscape is actually the main character. And so in a similar way, in Mike Johansson's work, the landscape outside of the cities is the main character, and it's just beautiful, beautiful as a literary work. And of course, we're working on a whole sub-series of Lesia Ukrainka's work. So we're planning. So we already published one play by Lesia Ukrainka called Cassandra, which is based on the obviously on the myth of Troy. So now we're still gonna push forward and try to publish Forest Song in this new translation that I mentioned. We have the Blue Rose that is also was supposed to be supported by this grant that was terminated, but we're hopeful to find people or organizations who would be willing to support the publication of that play as well. And we have another, The Boyar's Wife. It's about a Ukrainian woman who follows her husband to Moscow when he joins the service there, and basically observes the differences between the Ukrainian way of life and how it's done in Russia, especially in regard to women and women's rights. And potentially a collection of short stories by Lesa Ukrainka. There is a lot more. We publish a lot of poetry, essays, we publish short stories and so on. I really invite everyone just to check out our website. You can sign up there for notifications, and you're gonna get an email when the book is released that you're interested in. And again, the website is books.huri.harvard.edu, and you will see for yourself the beautiful diversity and breadth of Ukrainian literature and culture.
I think the last question I'll say here is everyone loves their listicles, I guess. So if you were to name 3 books of any genre, of any year, any author, 3 anything books to better know Ukraine, what would they be?
All right. Okay, I think that obviously it has to be Shevchenko. Shevchenko is the foundation of Ukrainian literature and culture. So if you get a chance to read the Kobzar, I would highly recommend that. Another book that I would definitely recommend is by Oksana Lutsishina. It's called Love Life. And the reason that I think that book is beautiful and wonderful is because it presents this universal experience of what it means to be a human being and experiencing desire and loss, even outside of where you are. So you can be Ukrainian and live in America and yet, kind of project that experience through your Ukrainianness. And that's exactly is a part of what Oksana Lutsishina accomplishes. The third book, let me think. I think potentially one book that probably definitely should be read to understand Ukraine better is Yuri Yanovsky's novel. The translation of the title is my working translation. It's called A Master of the Ship or The Shipmaster. And it's basically about the early Soviet Ukraine and the creation of the Dozhenko cinema studio in Odessa. And it's a beautiful description of the city of Odessa, of the energy that was there when people came together to create a Ukrainian film studio. And it kind of opens up a lot of historical facts about Ukraine's south that is not that well known. So I invite everyone to check that out. So we're also working on publishing that book potentially in 2026. But until then, you can also, if you're reading Ukrainian, read it in Ukrainian. If not, wait for that edition.
So earlier, I kind of pinned the issue of anti-Semitism and all that, and I did a whole episode about Jewish issues in Ukraine. But regarding literature specifically, one thing that I feel has been left out of a lot of the discussion of Ukrainian literature is the fact that a lot of that literature is in fact Jewish, and is kind of treated as a separate thing, both by scholars of Jewish literature and by scholars of Ukrainian literature. And there's lots of ways to kind of merge those two things together. So I would like to remind everyone that Tevye and His Daughters by Sholem Aleichem is also Ukrainian literature.
That's right. That's right. And Isaac Babel too, by the way, right? And so on. And so, in fact, for me, this is I feel that this is one of the areas that we need to work harder on opening up. And so that's the reason why we wanted and continue to want to publish that anthology of Ukrainian Jewish poetry. That's also why we published Mariana Kiyanowska's collection, The Voices of Bab and Yar, for example. And we're publishing Iya Kiva's collection called Silence Dressed in Cyrillic Letters. Alexandra Averbuch's collection, who also kind of dwells a lot on the question of identity. So that collection is titled Furious Harvests. So, and all of that is forthcoming either this year or early next year. So we're publishing, by the way, we're publishing a very interesting study by Alexander Kulik, who is a professor from Jerusalem. It's called Jews in Old Rus, to show basically that these connections and the presence of Jewish figures, Jewish communities, has a very long history in Ukraine, and we have lived and influenced each other over centuries and centuries. And so that's definitely something that needs to be more studied, more publicized, more opened up.
Yeah, that book on Jewish poetry was the next one I'm going to buy onto my stack of all the other books I have bought but not read yet. So thank you very much for talking to us. This is, of course, a very fascinating topic. A million different directions we could have gone in there. I kind of had to pause on some of those to keep going. But thank you very much for speaking to us.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And please remember to support Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian culture in whatever shape and form you can. I think that, again, investing in the future is what we need to do today.
Absolutely. And for all of our listeners and watchers, thank you very much for tuning in and holding your interest here. Again, this was Oleh Kotsyuba, the Director of Print and Digital Publications at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. If you would like to jump in on future interviews, if you'd like to ask us questions in the future, give us topics that you want us to cover, please go to patreon.com/NVUA, where you can join our list of subscribers and supporters. You will get, of course, these interviews, you'll get infographics, you'll get newsletters, and we are always looking to expand on our premium content. So thank you all very much for watching, and until next time, Slava Ukraini.